Welcome. My name is Abby Edgecombe. I'm the SCIP coordinator for Lincoln Lancaster County. If you're not familiar with SCIP, School Community Intervention and Prevention, we actually work with schools all over Nebraska, but I serve our Lincoln and Lancaster County schools. So we're in about 80 schools in this area. And we work with all sorts of different issues under the umbrella of behavioral health, but mental health, substance use prevention, intervention, suicide prevention, behavior disorders, all things, supporting students, K through 12. So we are here tonight with Whitney Chrisman, who's been a longtime partner of SCIP, and I'll let her kind of share a little bit about what she does. But I asked her to come and just share with us some of the youth substance use trends that we're seeing. More importantly, what are some of those conversations we need to be having with kids? And if we have students or kids that need extra support, what does that look like in and around our community? So I will turn it over to Whitney, and thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Whitney. I work at Genda right now, and we're just across the way, so it was convenient. I worked late tonight, and then I just scooted over. So, but before that, I did work at the Independent Center. I worked primarily with the adolescent population and residential, but all levels of care, really. And so with that, I had to work with a lot of family members, doing a lot of family therapy, how to support, a loved one who's struggling with substance use. But mostly what I do now is outpatient, but I do referrals to higher levels of care if needed, which sometimes happens. And I do a lot of co-occurring evaluations. So I'm assessing youth for mental health and substance use. There are times where youth won't have the mental health component and they'll just have the substance use, but it's rare. Usually they go hand in hand, and you guys have probably seen that or witnessed it because it's often like the chicken or the egg, what comes first, the mental health, and then we're coping with mental health through substance use, or because we're using so much, we have problems with mental health, and those emerge. So I'll talk about that a little bit tonight, but so I've been in somewhat conjunction with Abby with a lot of different things. I have spoken about marijuana use in the schools and what we're seeing in terms of trends there with school admin. This was like a couple summers ago. And then I used to do a really fun thing, but it was really hard to find and get youth to follow through with it. But we would bring adolescents in and have them talk to teachers, adolescents that are like in recovery and doing well. Who previously had problems with substance use, and they would talk to teachers and just talk about what was helpful, and that was really cool to see. And there still are a lot of them that are doing well. It's just hard to round them up and get them in. So yeah, we'll talk about a lot of various things tonight. If you guys have questions, go ahead and throw them at me. I'll take what I can get and hopefully answer them for you. And then I'll leave time for questions at the end, hopefully. We'll see as we go. I haven't formally ran through this presentation yet, so we'll see what my time management skills are. But I think I can do okay. So yeah, we're gonna look at substance use issues impacting the youth population, and then strategies to improve their well-being, and also just like how can you help as a parent. You can also kind of twist these into maybe your role as a teacher or just having a student in your life. How can you help? So I'll try to cater to all of my population that I'm working with tonight and give some examples. And I'm going to provide like research, and then I'll share like what I'm seeing, which sometimes doesn't always follow the research, but I just like to throw in like what I've seen a lot and what they've talked about a lot in sessions and in evaluations that I think eventually will catch up with the research, but it's interesting. So I'll kind of go along with those as well. So we'll go ahead and get started. So we're going to look at substance use trends in adolescents, both nationally and then in Nebraska, and then I'll talk about what I'm seeing in my outpatient clinic. Risks and protective factors for substance use, how social media is influencing our youth and what I'm hearing. Warning signs of use, like how can you tell? I'll also, in the mix of this, I'll also kind of go through with you how what's abuse, right, versus like experimentation. I think if you're a parent, I think it's really hard because it's like, well, what's developmentally normal for this age group? But then what's kind of crossing the line, and how do I differentiate between that? So I actually am going to go through the criteria of how we diagnose a substance use disorder. to help you kind of recognize like what are some of these things that I'm actually assessing for when I'm determining like what does this person need, how problematic is this use. And then I'm going to look at prevention and intervention strategies. And then if there is intervention warranted, like how do you move forward with that? I'm going to talk very briefly at the end just to help you kind of wrap your mind around it, because some parents, if they've never had to experience this before with themselves or other family members, then it's like, where do I start? Like, okay, yeah, my kid has a problem, but now what? And so I'll talk a little bit about that process and just the different levels of care available. To make sure that, you know, you have some awareness and understanding of it. So that's essentially what we're going to do tonight. Okay, so the first one is looking at the key findings from a study. And I looked at the National Institute of Drug Abuse because they do a lot of the research. And so these are the key findings, and I'm going to add more to them and kind of explain. Basically, from 2016 to 2020, 61% of drug use among 8th graders. It increased that much, which is pretty crazy, but also not at the same time. There's a lot of variables that's impacting and influencing that number. But the good thing, I will say, is from 2020 on, which you think would be the opposite. I personally thought, oh great, when COVID hit, I was like, these kids are gonna be using like crazy. I'm like, they don't have school, they have no pro-social activities, like they're isolated, their mental health is gonna go to crap. But what they have found, the studies have showed that substance use actually decreased and is kind of sustained since that time. And they kind of quoted, when I was reading about it, is that the social distancing played a factor, because when you think about adolescent use, they're usually using with friends, or can even be exposed to it at school, which I will talk about a little bit later when I'm talking with my clients. I'm trying to help them abstain from use. School can actually be a trigger just because of the ways they get around the loopholes. So I think that's a good thing, because what I know about other research in terms of mental health is that it was not the same in mental health realm, and the mental health decreased, and what I've been reading about suicide rates in adolescents and even young children because of COVID. So it's interesting to kind of see that, because I would have not predicted that. I would have put like all my money on substance use going through the roof. 62% of teenagers in the 12th grade have misused alcohol. I put a little star next to that because misused, I feel like, can have different meanings, right? And they didn't really clarify in the study what misused was. I believe it probably has to do with just using too much and experiencing some adverse effects. And then 50% of teenagers have misused a drug at least once in their teenage years. So that kind of, I mean, it tells you a little bit, but it's not the whole picture. Another thing that they mentioned, which I think is notable, and we've heard a little bit about it in the news, is that there's been an increase in drug-related overdoses among teenagers, and specifically related to fentanyl. And from what I see in my experience with that, I haven't seen a whole lot of youth, but I have had some clients that have overdosed on fentanyl, almost died, I mean pretty much revived through Narcan, is that they didn't know they were taking fentanyl. So it was laced with another substance. And so that's been my experience with working with youth that have overdosed from it, is that it was laced with something else. I had a client, it was laced with a Percocet that she took. And again, just a little amount can send you into an overdose and can be fatal. And so she's very lucky to be alive. So that's kind of, and it can be laced with a lot of different things. So that's the scary part of it. They don't think they're taking something. It could have been something that they've used many times before, and I think they have a tolerance to it, and then it's laced with fentanyl and they're ODing. So really scary stuff. Yeah. And even like, I have to have that conversation with some of my clients, because they'll come back at me with like, but I trust my drug dealer. Like, this is a good friend. Like, I trust them. They give me the right stuff. And I was like, you have to understand that they're not, but where does the drug dealer get it from? Like, there's levels of this. There's a hierarchy system. And so what you think, so it's interesting that they kind of feel like they have this level of protection. And I'll talk about the drug dealer situation too, and what I'm seeing and hearing in terms of who are selling these substances to our youth. Because it would actually, I think it would surprise a lot of parents specifically, maybe not teachers and people that work in this field, but definitely I think to parents. So.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Why is it laced with other things? Is it cheaper? Like, does it?
Yeah, so it's called kind of like, from what I understand, cutting the substance. So you have a substance that looks like I'll use cocaine for example. So it's cheaper to lace it with fentanyl and kind of give it to them, and it looks like it's all cocaine, but it really isn't. And so it's like they're trying to profit off of it, and then, yeah. I will say though, I think the criminal consequences if you are caught distributing fentanyl or leading to people dying from that, I've noticed that a lot of people that I've worked with or heard about, I actually just talked about it with another client, that there's a lot of harsh penalties for that. And I think it's to try to evade people doing that because there's people dying out there, and even kids. I mean, it's really scary. So here's the substance use trends in 2023. And I'm going to go through each of them. Now, you will see in this presentation that I talk about 8th graders, 10th graders, and 12th graders. The reason why I'm skipping freshmen and 11th graders is that they do not ask these questions. They do not dispense the questions to that age group. I don't know why, but they just choose 8th, 10th, and 12th graders. And so that's why the other two are missing. Would be interesting to see, but so this was a study, let me look it up. Monitoring the Future study, and they might have come out, I don't think they probably would have come out with 2024 yet, but we're always kind of a year behind. As of 2023, for alcohol, the percentages remain pretty stable for 8th and 10th graders. So we're not seeing any more alcohol use. It's kind of remained stable. And for 12th graders, it declined. And this is the most commonly used substance among all teenagers. This is nationwide, not necessarily in Nebraska, but nationwide. I'll get more specific to Nebraska in a little bit. But cannabis use remains stable again for 8th, 10th, and 12th graders, so it's not going up or down. This is the most commonly used illicit substance among teens, and 62% of those teenagers report vaping THC. And that's important, and I'll talk about that a little bit later too, but we are seeing a majority of them vaping and not necessarily, I mean, they still are using the flower form, but I think vaping is, you can conceal it more. It's accessible. It's not as you don't have to prepare it as much. I mean, there's a lot of more, I think, appealing qualities to that. Delta 8 use. A 2023 study indicates that 11% of 12th grade students used it in the past year. So there's a little bit difference between Delta 8 and cannabis. And I'm going to briefly, you may already know what the difference is, but I'm going to kind of explain it. It's different than cannabis. So Delta 9 is a primary component that is in your THC, and that's a psychoactive component. And that's what causes people to get high. In 2018, they passed a hemp law, which basically kind of allowed, so hemp is derived from the THC plant, but hemp is not psychoactive, meaning that it's not going to get you high. They use hemp. You'll see hemp in lotions and clothing. And so THC kind of put a little hold on getting these products out that contained hemp. And so the hemp law kind of bypassed things and allowed those hemp qualities to get through the system faster. And so it created a loophole though, because they are deeming Delta 8, they changed the component, the molecules in THC briefly, just to get around the law because it's illegal. And so they changed it and called it Delta 8, said it was less psychoactive than Delta 9, but in my experience, I don't think that to be accurate. So it's really interesting. So Delta 8, you can find that here in Lincoln. It's sold at a bunch of head shops. And I kind of did research on the ages, right? Like how old do you have to be to buy this substance? Because I think a lot of people will be like, oh, 21, right? But no, what I learned is that basically, when they passed Delta 8 and said, yeah, it technically isn't illegal, it's because of the hemp law of 2018, we're going to leave it up to the states to decide what age to kind of make people required to buy it. And so in Nebraska, to my understanding, 18. You can go in and buy it at 18. And what I will say about head shops too, and when I say head shops, these are just stores that sell these type of products. There are several of them in Lincoln. When I talk with my clients who are underage, so they're not even 18 yet, I have a lot of them tell me that they will sell to them, even though they're not 18. So they're getting through it. And I've had lots of clients to where I'm like, geez, are any of these stores monitored? Like, what's going on? So it makes you question a lot of things. So there is an ease of access here in Lincoln even to walk into a store and buy it as a youth. What else did I want to say? A lot of people too, and I've started to ask questions in my evaluation, I'll say, do you use Delta 8? Because a lot of our youth do not think, oh, that's not marijuana, that's not cannabis, it's Delta 8. And they don't realize it's really just one molecule off from Delta 9 and that it does produce the psychoactive qualities, so you do get high. And so they think if they use Delta 8 that they won't test positive on a drug urinalysis for THC, but they will. And so they don't even recognize that. And so I've really differentiated the language and I say, well, do you use Delta 8? And there's lots of different products besides Delta 8. I mean, there's a lot more products that they've just really genetically modified. And now we have some that are hallucinogenic. And so you are getting like this whole gamut of THC products that really are not regulated. It's scary.
And if you have that loophole.
Yep. And I think it will get even more interesting because, well, Nebraska just passed medicinal. And so now they decriminalized some of the THC related crime. So it'll be interesting. I would say it'll be interesting to see what kind of comes about this being passed. I think you could go both ways with it. Like there's obviously good to it, but then I think when I think of our youth, I'm like, well, how's that going to affect them and accessibility? Because you could have quite a, 2.5 ounces I think you can have on you. And I'm like, that's a lot of weed. So yeah, that's what, when I was looking at that law, I was like, gosh, yeah, this is interesting. Yeah, so Delta 8, and there's also, like, you probably have heard of CBD, right? And what's interesting on that is CBD is, a lot of these products that are supposed to be like low THC quality, I think they're supposed to be like 0.03% or less. It's interesting because they're not federally regulated, right? So we don't have any kind of government regulating and testing like, oh, this is exactly 0.03 or less. And so the problem with that is I will have like, especially when I was working at the Independent Center, because a lot of the Independent Center's kind of values is to abstain. Like it's not really harm reduction. It's like, hey, you need to like not use anything. And so it would be interesting because a lot of my youth would be like, well, I can use CBD because there's no THC in it. And it helps me sleep, it helps me eat, it helps with some of my pain that I have. And so, but they would still test positive for THC using CBD only. And then they'd be like so shocked. They're like, well, I'm not using weed. And I'm like, well, here's the deal. And you have to educate them that it's not regulated. So there probably is more THC in it than you think. And that's why you're testing positive. And so it's all about education. And again, these youth aren't getting that education when they walk into the head shops. They're not getting this education on social media because they're promoting these products. So it's very interesting. So so if you're a parent or a teacher, if you're saying cannabis or THC, are you using that? And you're asking it point blank like that, the youth might say no because they're not. They're using Delta 8. And you didn't ask that. So I'm not going to tell you. So I've been differentiating that in my evals. And I will say about 90% of the time, they're like, oh, well, yeah, I'm using Delta 8. I'm like, oh, okay. Well, I'm glad I asked that now. So it's just interesting. And I think we'll see more and more of this and more genetically modified stuff, and it'll be very interesting to see what comes out next. And I will say, I've had a lot of youth that sometimes get admitted to CAPS, the at Bryan Health because they go to the ER because they're having an adverse effect from THC gummies. And part of that issue is because the gummies are ingested, right? So it takes longer to get into your system. And so because of that delay, they're like, oh, well, I'm not getting the effect of it, so I need to take more. So they take more, and then that's when it all hits them. And then I've even heard of like synthetic gummies being produced and that really taking a toll, experiencing like paranoia, just don't even know where they are, suicidal ideations. I mean, really some scary stuff for the adolescents. One of my clients had gotten into a car and was driving, and then it hit him, and then he pulled over but didn't know where he was, and then I think the parents had Life 360 on him and found him in this random apartment complex. I mean, it was some scary stuff that could have led to some negative things and scary situations if they had not found him. So nicotine remained stable for 8th graders and declined in both 10th and 12th grades, which is nice to know. Because it just seems like we're constantly fighting that battle against vapes. And then other illicit drug use. So they asked specific questions regarding cocaine, heroin, and the misuse of prescription drugs. So they did not ask like about fentanyl or any of those other substances, which I would venture to guess that they would ask like in the future studies because it's becoming more prominent. But not necessarily in Nebraska. It's interesting because it's really the opiate problem and fentanyl problem has really remained on kind of the east and west coasts. Hasn't really necessarily hit Nebraska yet. We have seen sprinkles of it, but not at the capacity of like, I mean, if you watch some of those documentaries and you're seeing all the overdose deaths, it's crazy. So one of the other like misuse of prescription drugs that I'm seeing our youth misusing are like the opiates. So you got hydrocodone, Oxycontin, those pain medications that they're maybe getting from people in their family that are prescribed them. I will see them misuse tramadol too, which is a muscle relaxer. So I've seen that a time or two. And then the other thing that they're doing is like misusing their Adderall and like just ADHD medication. They can misuse it. Sometimes they just take a lot of it, like the higher dose than they need to, or they'll crush it up and snort it, and then it kind of allows them to party longer. So, but that's also problematic because we're mixing if they're drinking and then we're mixing a depressant with a stimulant, it's not good on the physical health of people. So, but they use it to keep them going, right? Because depressant kind of acts as a sedative, and then now we're stimulating the body to be able to party more. So, I am seeing that. I will see there are youth using methamphetamine, which is another scary thing, and I think it's more prominent than people realize. But it's really easy to get in Nebraska. It's a cheaper substance than cocaine, and also if parents are using it, then there's accessibility there. And unfortunately, I've had several cases where that's where the kids are getting it, is their parents. So in Nebraska, teenagers in Nebraska are about, I'm just going to round because why not, 2% less likely to have used drugs last month than the average American teen. 84.62% of them are using marijuana in the last month, so that's a pretty high amount, but not surprising to me anyways. They're about 10% more likely to use alcohol than the average American teen in their age group, and about 2.5 of all 12 to 17-year-olds met the criteria for a substance use disorder in their age group. And I will go through that criteria for you. When I kind of look at these and I kind of think about, okay, well, what's the underlying like variables behind these numbers? I do think that in regards to alcohol, it's kind of interesting. You look at a bunch of different things about Nebraska in general, and you hear, I mean, there is a stereotype about Nebraska, oh, there's nothing to do here, right? And my youth will say that. They'll say, well, what else are we going to do? Like, it's winter, this is closed, it's cold, we don't want to do that. So it's interesting. I do think we also have to look at like society-wise, like our culture in Nebraska specific to like rural areas, but also like think about what we like to do on the weekends. So we got Nebraska football. Well, what's usually associated with that? Well, we got tailgating, we got alcohol use. Think about how we usually celebrate things. So we got holidays, we got birthdays. anniversaries, graduations, weddings, even funerals. What do people have usually around those things? Alcohol. Not always, but I will say, I mean, a lot of these events that I go to, there's alcohol if you need it. So I think it also has to do with like what's around them and what's normalized. And I do think alcohol is fairly normalized in Nebraska. So when we talk about what's a substance use disorder, I think it's important to look at like what's experimenting and I think normal for the adolescent group developmentally, and then what meets criteria for like a use disorder. What am I looking at when people come to me? I think if you're going to take away anything about that or remember anything about that, it needs to be recurrent use. There has to be some pattern to it, okay? But I'm going to go through it and kind of explain to you what I'm looking at when somebody comes and I'm doing an evaluation on them, to kind of just give you like a frame of reference. So the first thing on the list is they have to take a substance in larger amounts or over a longer period than they intended to. So what that means is when they're using more than just your average drink, okay? We are overindulging, we're becoming intoxicated, we're taking several hits, we're getting high, okay? Or the other thing to this is it's an extended period of time that we're doing it. So maybe you do it here and there, but now we're doing it for months on end, okay? So you kind of gather that like, we have this pattern going on, okay? It's not a one-time use thing. The next one is that there's a desire or unsuccessful efforts to control or stop, okay? So I'm looking at, well, have you tried to stop before? What happened when you tried to stop? I will hear teens, first of all, the teens that really have a problem are like, I haven't tried, why would I quit? Why would I stop? And so they haven't even actually tried. But the ones that are like maybe gotten in trouble or get put on probation and they're like kind of being tested and there's a motivation to stop, right? They might say, well, I stopped for a few days, but then something happened and I got really angry. I'll give you an example of someone I just talked to the other day. I stopped for 4 days. I really want to start the new year resolution of not using. I want to go to school. I want to meet all my goals. But 4 days in, something happened with my dad. I got really mad and I just couldn't handle it anymore. I just couldn't do it. So I needed to get marijuana. So that's just kind of an example of like trying to stop, but something happened and now we're using it as like a coping mechanism. That's our primary coping mechanism that got taken away, and she, even though she had other coping skills, felt like that one was the most effective, which you will hear from a lot of teens, that it's like harder to implement the skills that they learn because it's just a quick fix, right? And it's immediate. I'll talk about that a little bit more later because that's one of the primary things that we have to adjust with our teens, is that you give them coping skills, but that's what they've been using as their primary coping skill for months on end, sometimes years. Even if they're taught new skills, they don't realize that like marijuana can like sometimes take that emotion away, right? We numb ourselves. So it takes away our problems momentarily, and so we like it for that reason. When you implement a coping skill, it's not going to take that emotion away. It's going to reduce that emotion. It's going to make it maybe more tolerable, but it's not going to take it away. And so when teens are like, when you approach them with that and you're like, well, wait, like, why would I try that when this one's immediate and faster? You have to think about adolescents are all about immediate gratification because their brains aren't fully developed. And so they're going to opt to do that over these coping skills that take time and practice and repetitiveness. And they're just like, no, that sounds awful, Whitney. But I have to like keep kind of pressing them and, a lot of education and a lot of persistence. And they actually do, once they kind of are able to stop using, they will come back and say, oh yeah, actually you were right. And they're like, I know, no. It's not about being right. Yeah.
They come back and say, maybe you didn't know.
Yeah. Maybe Whitney does have a degree. I don't know. So they have unsuccessful efforts to try and stop. And so that's another key thing. And they don't have to have all of these. I'll explain like what kind of is the cutoff for these things, but these are just things to think about. Number 3 is the amount of time they're spending either using the substance, obtaining the substance, or recovering from the effects of the substance. So there's a lot there packaged in there, but basically amounts to how much time are they spending out of their day using this substance. And when I think about teens, you know, how much of their day is spent trying to get it or thinking about it at school, or maybe they go to school late because they smoked right before bed and then it made them really tired, so they missed their alarm and now we're coming to school really late. Same thing with like how long does it take you to get over a hangover, how much time have you spent doing that. And also I think about, you know, the substances that aren't readily available to them, they have to kind of finagle, right? They can't just go in and buy alcohol because they're not 21, so they're going to have to find somebody who's old enough to do it. Then they're going to have to get them the money somehow. Then they're going to have to meet up and secretly. I mean, that takes time. So how much effort are you spending obtaining it, using it, and recovering from it? And so I kind of have to assess how much of their time is spent doing that. And I also kind of look at like, how much time are you high throughout the day? Because I'll ask the youth, and especially the ones that have like a severe, I'll just use cannabis because like it's used a lot. They'll be like, well, I wake and bake, and then I go to school because I can't go to school unless I'm high because I have such bad anxiety. And I just can't deal with the crowds and I can't deal with the people. So I wake and bake, and then I go to school. And then sometimes on my lunch break, I'll smoke again. And then that'll make me through the day. And then after I get home from school, I'll smoke again. And then that helps me eat my supper. And then once I eat my supper and I'm ready for bed, then I'll smoke again. And that is probably a very routine. I would say I hear that from a lot of my clients. Like, that is the schedule. And again, that's more severe use, right? But that's kind of their day. And that's a lot of their day high. Okay, the next one is a craving for the substance or a desire to use, okay? So I kind of try to always compare this to like if you have it's not the same, but to like conceptualize it, craving for like your favorite meal or dessert, right? You have that craving, you really want to use it. How much time are you thinking about it? Are you sitting in class, can't wait for that bell to ring so I can go use? Like, how much are you craving that substance? Recurrent use to where it meets role obligations. So think about, particular to adolescents, like what are their roles in life? Well, they're typically a student, so that's one of their roles. Maybe they're an older sibling, maybe expected to take care of younger siblings. Maybe their role is to clean up or do some chores around home. And maybe they have a role in some sort of job or employment. So I kind of look at those and I'm saying, how is it affecting those different areas, right? Are you getting bad grades because of your substance use, because you're not going to class, or you're skipping class to go use, or maybe you're high during class and just not understanding the subject being taught? Are you coming to school or work late, or getting in trouble at work because you're high, or messing up while you're at those jobs? And then is it affecting your ability to like function in the household? And it's really interesting. I will hear a lot of parents say kind of like they just kind of retreat, they isolate. They might not have any problems with doing chores, and then all of a sudden we're extremely oppositional and don't want to do that. So it's interesting. So we're looking at how is it affecting the different roles that they have in their life. Continued use despite social and interpersonal issues. So again, this is a pattern, right? It's not just like, oh, I got drunk once, came home, mom found me, now mom's really mad at me and disappointed in me, and I have a consequence. That is not necessarily this scenario. This is, I've done that already, I continue to drink, and now mom's perpetually mad at me. We're perpetually conflict. And that isn't just with parents. It can be interpersonal issues with friends. I've had it where I've had a parent tell me recently in an evaluation, well, yeah, once she started doing this, her good friend groups kind of distanced from her. And then she started to get in with this other group, and that wasn't a good influence. So you'll see some of these friendships deteriorate, or there'll be conflict with that. Or you'll even have like teens in relationships where their significant others like, hey, you're using way too much. Like they'll call them out and be like, I'm scared for you. And that's causing issues within that relationship too. So I'm looking at how is it affecting how you interact with other people in these relationships. Important activities that they like are being reduced. So I've seen it in my practice where these youth are really good at sports, and all of a sudden they just stop. Either because, and I'll hear it for 2 reasons. One is that their use, usually if it's marijuana, it actually affects their endurance. So they might be really good track athletes, or even like I've seen it in basketball, and then it's just like they can't keep up. Or they start to have issues with their coaches when they usually haven't. They become more irritable. They're more defensive when they're critiqued. And they're like, yeah, I don't want to deal with it anymore, so I quit. And these are like really good athletes where I'm like, you could have had a chance at like some decent scholarships or, moving on, and they just stop. And that has a profound effect, because I think it's more than just the sport. It's the camaraderie. It's filling up pro-social time so that they're hanging out with these social people, and also people that probably aren't using substances at that moment because they're participating in a sport. So it's just really sad when I hear those things, but it could be other activities. You'll hear like, oh, well, she used to really like doing this. She used to draw, or she used to do art, and now she's not really doing anything. Or maybe they had jobs and then they got fired for whatever reason and completely stopped doing anything. So you'll kind of see different things related to that, but you'll see reduced activities. And again, it relates to a pattern. It's not just like a one-time thing. It's like we're consistently using, and so now these activities are reduced. Using in situations in which it could be physically hazardous. So what this means is that they're kind of engaging in high-risk opportunities to get hurt, essentially. So this would be like driving under the influence. And again, teenagers will say to me, well, like, I drive better when I'm high. And I'm like, nah, no, the research does not support that. But they'll say that to me, and a lot of them don't see a harm in it. And they'll tell you that. They will have a different opinion on alcohol in driving, but marijuana in driving, they'll kind of like poo-poo that a little bit. And again, there's this perception that it's not that bad to them. Even when presented with like alternative evidence, they really are like, they're quick to not believe it. So driving under the influence is like one of the main ones, but there's other things too. Like you've got to think about adolescent behavior. So it's like, oh, okay, am I more apt to not have a seatbelt on when I'm high or drinking? Am I more apt to like jump off buildings, or not like high buildings like suicide, but more just like high risk behavior, jumping off a moving vehicle. I had one client who was like, yeah, I skateboarded around town and I was high and it was the greatest thing ever. And I'm like, okay, well, let's kind of reverse that and process that, because could that be dangerous? Like, and it's interesting because, yeah, absolutely. And so I look at what's physically hazardous is kind of an array of things. And I actually went to a training where I think it was somebody from UNMC, and he was saying that he considers it physically hazardous. They could qualify for this criteria if they're going to school high, because he was saying that it's physically hazardous to the learning environment, to kids trying to learn. Cognitively, you just can't process that information, and so he was actually like including that in there, which I thought was interesting. So. Continued use despite physical or psychological issues that you're aware of, or it exasperates issues. So for adolescents, usually physically adolescents are pretty healthy, right? We're not seeing a lot of those long-term substance use effects that we'll see with like alcohol use or any other kind of use in general. But I will say adolescents that have asthma or maybe some allergies can be affected by continued inhalation of smoke, right? It can irritate that. And so that would qualify, right? That meets this criteria, because you know you have asthma, but you're smoking on top of it. And sometimes they were like, yeah, I have a hard time breathing now. And they like chuckle about it. And it's like they don't recognize like the significance of that at that age. I mean, you're already having breathing troubles and you're 16. Psychologically, so if you have somebody who has depression and been diagnosed with that, and then we're drinking on top of it, we're putting a depressant on top of depression, and so it's going to exacerbate those symptoms. For marijuana, if a person already has anxiety, and I'll talk about this a little bit, if a person has anxiety and then they're using marijuana to try to cope with that anxiety, There is some research that says that small amounts of marijuana can help with anxiety. But the alternative is true, is that if you use a lot of marijuana, which a lot of these kids eventually get into, is that it actually produces the opposite effect and induces anxiety. And I see that a ton. I will have clients that'll be like, well, that's the only way I'm going to manage my anxiety is weed. Like, I have nothing else. Like, nothing else works, is what they'll tell me. But then it's interesting because once I'm able to get them sober, they will say, wow, didn't realize how less of anxiety I have right now because I'm sober. And so it actually, and I see that it induces that anxiety. And so that holds true kind of in that research of small doses help, but larger regular use of marijuana induces it. So, and I will tell you, the amount of youth that have come into my office that say I have social anxiety, I think is in part of two things, not just marijuana. I think the phones play a big part in social anxiety now, but I do think marijuana plays a huge factor in it. And they'll just say things like, I just can't do the crowds. I just can't go to school. Too much going on. Almost overstimulated in a way. And I think that's just a result of that, like inducing that anxiety, some paranoia that comes with marijuana use. So it's just super interesting that the amount of anxiety our kids are experiencing, that I'm like, that debilitating to where we're like, just, I'm not even going to go to school. I'm not even going to try that. And that's a lot of the truancy cases I kind of work with. Tolerance to a substance. So that just means I have to use more and more of that same substance to reach a high. Our bodies tolerate substances and they adapt to it. And so then they have to smoke more to get a high. And some of my clients will even say, I just didn't even get high anymore. I was smoking so much, I just couldn't even get high. And that's where you'll see like a crossover into different substances because that's not giving them a high anymore. So now I need to use something else to reach that same euphoria. So that's where I kind of see them drifting into other things and experimenting with stuff because it's just not cutting it. And then the last one is withdrawal. And this is another thing. My adolescents were like, no way does marijuana have withdrawal symptoms. But I try to pose it to them like this. I'm like, listen, caffeine has withdrawal. Think about if you drink a pop every day and then one day you forget to drink a pop, what do you usually experience? And they'll say, well, headaches. Exactly, that's withdrawal. It might be subtle, but it's still withdrawal. And so a lot of adolescents, I think, experience withdrawal, but they kind of attribute it to something else. So common withdrawal symptoms for marijuana are like irritability, headaches, nausea, lack of appetite, sleep disturbance. And you could probably say, oh, well, yeah, I have a headache today. I don't know why. I didn't drink enough water or something. You can kind of rationalize your way around it. But I oftentimes will ask them, well, have you started to, since you stopped smoking, have you experienced these things? And a lot of them will say, well, yeah. And then when I say, well, that's withdrawal, then they're like, no, it's not. I'm like, well, you just described it. But I saw a lot of that, especially working in residential, where you take a kid who's using a ton of weed and then you put him in a controlled setting where they can't use anything. I would notice, it wasn't right away, it was about week 2 of residential. I wanted to do a study on this so bad, because I'm like, I feel like I'm onto something. But that second week, it would be like an attitude shift change in those adolescents. And they were fighting with staff, and they were quick to be irritable, and little things were just setting them off. When they came in, you were not getting that same thing. Week 2, it usually happened. It usually kind of happened for like 2 to 3 days, maybe that whole week. Week 3 and 4, usually they were back to kind of more mellow, not as reactive. And I was seeing that pretty consistently, and to the point where we would joke about it. We'd be like, it's week 2. Buckle up, because they're going to be fighting with staff, and staff are going to be mad and coming to us. We're going to have to talk to them about it. And so it was a lot of education on my part too, with working with like mental health techs, so saying like, hey, I think he's withdrawing, like give a little grace and patience. Here's some of the ways you can approach him. But I was definitely seeing those withdrawal symptoms, and it was more irritability and quick reactive, like things that normally would not bug them, and all of a sudden we're getting mad. So I always like to educate that, because withdrawal can happen in any substance, so look out for it. So those are the 12 or 11 criteria, sorry. And so how we differentiate, we usually do a mild, moderate, or severe. And so mild would be 2 to 3 of these symptoms, okay? Moderate be 4 to 5, and then 5 and above is severe. So this just kind of helps you kind of like look at it, because even if they qualify for 1 or 2 of these things, it could be more like experimental. It could be more where maybe we get with the wrong group and we're doing a couple of things that are reckless, impulsive. Because again, it's important to remember that adolescents are impulsive in nature anyways. And so it's very common to see them experiment with substances and have some consequences to substance use. But the key here is a recurrent pattern that I'm really looking at. This is happening a lot, and it's also kind of affecting more than one setting. So here's kind of the risk. I've already kind of talked about these a little bit, and I'm sure a lot of you guys already know, so I'm probably not going to speak. Well, maybe parents don't know. Sorry. Sometimes I forget my audience. So one thing that I really highlight to parents is that THC is not like it was 10 years ago, definitely not what it was like 20 years ago. It's so much more potent. They are able to create these hybrids, these genetic modified plants, to have a very high level of THC that they're extracting. And so the high is that much more intense, and it affects the cognitive functioning that much more. And so sometimes you'll get parents that don't understand that. And so they'll compare it to when they were using THC, and they're like, oh, they kind of brush it off. I think now I think it's more, there's more awareness about it now, but I will say, like, when cannabis, like even like 2 or 3 years ago, it was like these parents were like, it's not a big deal. And kind of having to remind them. The other thing too is that you have to remember that adolescents' brains aren't fully developed. And so I try to highlight that to parents, is that it affects their brains. Their brains are not, the prefrontal cortex is not fully matured, which is our decision making. It's where we assess, will this action have a consequence? Should I do this? Is this morally right? Like, we're looking at those things. And over time, we become less impulsive, right? Because it's our prefrontal cortex. We're able to kind of look at that and say, probably shouldn't do that. Probably should wear my seatbelt. Maybe I shouldn't go to that place because this could happen. Adolescents it's still progressing in their brain. And if they've had trauma, that stunts them. They're already kind of like at risk for a stunted prefrontal cortex because trauma does that. So what's interesting though is that THC use can affect a teenager's IQ. And that's important because we will have teenagers that are very smart, and then they start using, and again, this has to be like regular use. It's not just once in a while. This is like continued sustained use. I think the last time I read about this, which it has been a while, was I think up to 8 IQ points. And you don't get those points back, by the way. And so that's quite a bit when you think about intelligent quotient. And also can lead to mental health issues. So we're seeing a lot of depression and anxiety. I already spoke to the anxiety. The other mental health portion to this is it can also lead to major mental health issues. The key here, though, is that the research is all kind of saying if you're predisposed. But I mean, that's a lot of people still. And what I mean by predisposed is that somebody in your family has a major mental health illness. And what I'm saying, when I say major mental health, I'm really alluding to schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, psychosis. And when I say psychosis, it's like there's a level of delusion and like even hallucinations. And so if you have a predisposition to this, meaning you have a genetic marker for it, it actually can exacerbate and appear sooner than normal major mental health symptoms appear. So typically you will see major mental health start to appear in like ages 18 to like 21. That's when you'll start to see these major mental health, especially like schizophrenia. You typically don't see it younger unless for some reason THC kind of just turns that gene on. And so and the scary thing about that is when someone enters psychosis, sometimes they don't ever come out of it. Now, in my experience, I've seen them do a lot better, but there's a chance that like they could live with that then for the rest of their life and not necessarily after they abstain from use, then you see those symptoms go away. And that's usually what I've seen, but I have read that there's a possibility that you have to deal with that major mental health illness and manage it the rest of your life. So I saw this in a very young, I'm saying very young. She was, I think, about 19 or 20. So considered an adult in Nebraska, but had been admitted to mental health ward, was delusional, was just like not making sense. And so they admitted her to treatment, and her primary drug of choice, marijuana, using it very heavily, using THC dabs, which are high potent form of marijuana. And it was so interesting because she disclosed in group that something very traumatic had happened to her. She'd been sexually abused by a family member. And everyone was like floored in group. We were like, okay, like it was like the first time she was talking about this, so it hadn't been reported, and we were all like, oh my gosh. And anyways, come to find out, she was in active psychosis, was delusional. None of that had actually happened. And when she had come out of her psychosis, and usually there's med management that helps with that. And so when she came out, she actually came back to group, said, oh my gosh, I don't even know why I said that. Not even true. Was just delusional, believed it. And she was so serious in group, like she truly believed. We were all like, oh my gosh, responding to it, trying to make sure that we were supporting her. And then she came back and said, and it wasn't like one of those deals where it was like, oh, I just spilled the family beans and now I have to like clear that up because I don't want to get anybody in trouble. It was truly, I was delusional in group. I was in active psychosis, and none of that was true. And there was like several other things that she said that eventually were like, that didn't happen. So it was really interesting to watch and see that play out. And when I look back on it, I was one of the group leaders occasionally in that group, and I was like, oh yeah. Like you could see, it was just different things besides like what she was reporting that you're like, she definitely was delusional, so. And then also you will see some physical health repercussions. So CVS is cyclical vomiting syndrome. And then cannabis hyperemesis, I believe I'm saying that right, syndrome. They're two different things, but they're kind of similar. Cyclical vomiting is basically where, and this is just how THC kind of binds to the gastrointestinal system and some of the receptors there. Not everybody gets this, but some people do. I kind of describe it almost like you use marijuana so much and so heavy that all of a sudden you kind of become allergic to it. But they will they'll keep vomiting, they can't stop. And then it will enter into an actual syndrome where essentially they become, anytime that they use marijuana, then they will get extremely ill. They'll be puking, and really the only thing that helps them, and this is interesting, is hot showers or baths. So this is interesting. I have worked with this client for years, on and off. Always struggled with substance use, but marijuana has been the primary thing that she struggled with. And over the summer, very impulsive too, but over the summer, basically got cannabis hyperemesis and was basically absconding from home and was in a different state and could not drive because she was puking so much. Then she became dehydrated. She basically had to find a way to get herself to the ER, and did, and they were like, you are extremely malnourished, like you need to be hooked up, IVs, all of that. And the experience was very scary. I mean, she was all alone, could have been taken advantage of, had to pull over multiple times because she could not stop puking. And it was related to her substance use. It was her cannabis use. And so I will say that I am seeing this more often. And all the research I've kind of read is a lot of the emergency department intakes related to cannabis use have been about this. So I think you'll see it more often, especially this is more heavy use, like I said, heavy and prolonged use of cannabis. All of a sudden they just kind of become, I just describe it as being allergic to it. You use it and then all of a sudden your body can't handle it. Yes. Yeah. And that's what they say, that there's like really no cure except for abstaining. And I think they're gonna probably do more research on this because it's kind of just, because cannabis is relative in the time span of, I guess, humanity, newly, it's been normalized and it's also been, legalized. And so more and more people are using it, which just, you're going to have the more people that have accessibility to it. And there's no real like consequences, I guess, to using it. Legally anyways, you will see more and more people abusing it, just like you have alcohol, right? Easily accessible, people can get it, gas stations can steal it. And by the way, that's usually how our youth are getting it, is stealing it from gas stations. They will tell me that, they'll steal bottles. They'll go into stores like Walmart and just sneak a bottle under their hood and walk out. And they get pretty good at it. Yeah, so I think you'll see more and more of that happen, which is so crazy to me because cannabis is often given to people to stop people from puking. And then here it is and causing that. So it has to do with the receptors and probably in the intestinal system. Yeah. It's truly very debilitating. I mean, when she was describing like her state of physical, like how her body was in a different state, I was like, you're extremely lucky that you made out of that how you did. I mean, I was just thinking of all of the things that could have gone wrong with that. Vulnerable, young, attractive female on the side of the road. So some of the risks of substance use in teens, right? What kind of leads to it, right? What are some of these variables that can lead a young individual down a path of not great choices? Underlying mental health issues. So again, they're trying to cope. That's their main thing that they're using this for. And I say marijuana, I'm talking a lot about marijuana, but that's like, again, 82% of our people, our young youth are using this. Alcohol, same thing though. We're trying to cope with some kind of problem, whether it's family issues, whether it's stress from school, whether it's interpersonal issues, and we're using that as a coping skill. Peer influence, so hanging out with individuals who are also using the substance, again, is highly influential for teenagers. If their parents are using, two things, maybe the accessibility to it, but also if a parent's using it, it's normalized or it's seen as okay, or they're modeling, I'm upset, I'm gonna go drink. I'm upset, I'm gonna go smoke weed. So they're modeling this type of behavior that whether or not they realize it, the youth are taking in as normative or, oh yeah, that's just what I do. And you will have some older siblings that are trying to be protective, but you also see a lot of it like, hey, just come with me and it's okay. And again, it's normalized, so they don't think it's harmful, and so why not? Low academic achievement or low school engagement is a risk factor for substance use. Again, that plays into a lot of different things. Now we have low self-worth. We don't have a lot of engagement with teachers. Maybe we don't like teachers. Maybe we don't like admin. Maybe we feel like we're not supported there. Maybe we don't like some of the peers that we're going to school with. And then we have these other peers that are skipping school. And that seems more appealing to me than going to school. And so now I'm just not going to go, or I'm going to skip class, or I'm going to go to the bathroom and smoke. But now they kind of have these detectors, so we're getting creative.
They find out.
They do. Nooks and crannies, yeah. Or history of trauma, again, that increases their risk of using substances. And there's a lot of different interesting research on it. I'm not going to go too much into it, but I did a presentation a while ago, basically on why some of women being human trafficked, how they kind of get coerced with substance use, but also they cope with substance use when they're being trafficked. And one of the things that I read about was that when you have trauma, it does affect some of the receptors in your brains, which makes you more susceptible to opiate addiction. And so it's just really interesting, and there's a lot of research on it. So if you have time, look into it. But the protective factors is if there's parental involvement. And what I mean by that is not necessarily like we are hypervigilant and checking our kids' phones. It's more about open discussions about what's going on in the youth's life, maybe not even related to substance use, but what are your stressors? What's going on at school? Just having open discussions too about substance use in general. It doesn't have to be taboo. And it doesn't have to be where you start off like kind of negative about it. It needs to be open. It needs to be, you want your youth to engage in the conversation, and you don't want to react even if it's something that could be negative. Because if you react negatively right away, they're going to shut down, because they're going to look at that and be like, oh, I can't talk about that with you. Monitoring, when I say monitoring, I'm not, again, I don't want you necessarily going through your youth's phone, because that is just there's a lot of conflict with that. But there is a lot of monitoring in the sense of where's your kid at? Where are they going? Who are they hanging out with? Do you know them? Where are they going to go? What time are you going to be back? Like, just some of those basic things. That's what I mean by monitoring. I don't mean like, okay, how fast are you going using Live 360? I saw you were speeding. It's more of like, hey, like having those expectations, right? Because there's a balance, right? We don't want to be like overprotective and smothering, because then that creates some secretive behaviors and some like, I'm going to snake around that. But it's also not super passive either, where we're just like, yeah, you can go, come back whenever. Or maybe you just don't even know where they are, and it's kind of this like open door policy where we're in and out, and I don't care what time you come home, you don't have a curfew. And we do have a lot of parents like that, and a lot of times you will see when parents are so passive, they are struggling themselves, whether it's financially, whether it's with their own relationship, whether it's I'm trying to make ends meet, I'm working late, and so now I'm not even home and I can't necessarily monitor you. So there has to be some level and some balance of it, and so it's important to know those things. And that's where check-ins are important. Check in with me every once in a while, and you have to set the expectation. Having a conversation about where you discuss, I don't approve of underage substance use. And I will say this, when I have a lot of parents that later it comes out that they smoke weed or they take gummies. And I think parents for the most part try to hide that, but just know your teenagers are a lot more observant than you think. And when parents are also using that substance, it does create this narrative in a teenager's mind that it's okay, or that they just see that. And so I think it's just important to be aware of it. I think it's important to have discussions about, I don't want you to like condemn or scold, because again, I think that shuts them down. I think it's important to have discussions about their substance use, and again, be open and receptive to what they have to say, because as a parent, you want to kind of know, is this experimental, or is this something you really need to be concerned about? And if it's something that is concerning, or they have an addiction to it, we talked a lot about this at the Independence Center with parents about if your child truly does have a problem and they are going to go to that substance and seek it out, can you model in your home not using that substance at all? So whether that be marijuana or even alcohol. And some parents really struggle with that, because they're like, well, I'm of age and I drink normally and socially, and I think it's okay because I'm the adult. But we kind of framed it in this way, and this can be controversial, but I think this is a good like thinking point anyways, of like, if your child had an allergy to peanut butter, would you have peanut butter in the home? And most parents would say, absolutely not. I would take it out, right? But when you compare that to like alcohol, well, your child has a problem with alcohol, addicted to it. Would you still have alcohol in the home? And then parents are like, well, it's different. Well, and they kind of get defensive about that. It's my home or whatever. I don't have a problem with it. So, but it's the concept, right? Like, you're trying to support your child in not using something that they have a problem with. It's not experimental. We're past that. It is, we are addicted to it. We are searching it out. We are taking bottles and drinking it from mom's cabinet, and we are replacing it with water. Like, we are sneaking it around. We're getting drunk at our house. We've had multiple instances. Would you keep it there still? And having those discussions with parents. And it does make them uncomfortable. But I like to use that analogy in a way, because parents are really quick to say, absolutely, I would not have peanut butter in my home. But then when you say, okay, well, think about it in terms of this. And it's interesting, because I always kind of like to say this as well. When they created the 12-step book, when they made the big book, they did not have the research that addiction was a disease yet, but they described it as an allergy of the brain. And so basically some people had it, some people didn't. Some people could drink and stop, and some people couldn't stop drinking. And so, you know, I see where that analogy came about then. School connectedness, if they're connected to a school in some way, even if that's just a teacher that they really like, doesn't even have to be what the school has to offer. It could just be one single teacher. I think sometimes teachers underestimate how much students, sometimes that's all the positive role model they have in their life because they don't have it at home. And sometimes I just don't think teachers recognize the influence that they have on these kids. But I will have kids and they will tell you, I love this teacher and I just want to stay in her class all day because she makes me feel safe, she listens to me. And so there are teachers out there. And so even if they just have one teacher, that's great. School connectedness, no, could be also like, are you involved in any extracurriculars? And you know, the cool thing I think about LPS is that you can make your own club. I think there has to be certain parameters around it. But I have a client right now who like is part of a club, she loves it. And they meet and they have goals and they're trying to do all these activities. And that just keeps her a little bit longer at school where she's not with those peers. So, and that's what goes into pro-social activities, like what do these kids have on the side? What are they doing? And it, obviously like sports are one thing, clubs are another thing, dance is one thing, but it doesn't necessarily have to be those things. It could just be, hey, do you have a job? Do you have a part-time job? Do you have a neighbor that needs help taking out his trash or scooping snow and you can get money from that? Like, what are you doing? Because time spent doing something pro-social is time taken away from substance use. And I will say there are jobs where the youth smoke on break. So it gets a little hairy because sometimes I'm like, oh great, I got my youth a job, we got them started. And then they come back and they're like, yeah, everybody vapes on break. And they offer it to me and I'm like, shit. So, but now we have to navigate that. And I will be very specific, like there are places, and I could name them, but I'm not going to call out businesses, but where I'm like, yeah, don't work there. Like automatically, I'm like, yeah, no, notoriously they smoke. So if you're trying to stay away from that and trying to distance yourself from that, like that place probably isn't it. So you can talk to me after if you want to know. Yeah. Yes, and I'm glad you mentioned that. I might talk about that later, I'm not sure, but I'll just talk about it now. So a big thing, and a lot of the reasons I will hear from youth, and now you're talking about college students even, is they will use substances in order to sleep at night. Or they just have poor sleep in general. But specifically, I will have a lot of teenagers that come in my office and they'll say, I use marijuana as a sleep aid. But then what I see kind of on the reverse end of that is what I kind of mentioned before, where like they smoke before bed and then it makes them so tired and they're really groggy in the morning and they're hard to wake and it's just like residual effects almost. But yeah, the sleep deprivation, and I think too, and this is an interesting part, some of the Adderall use is like used to compensate for that, and I think that's more college age students. If you guys have time, there's it might not still be on there because this came out maybe 3 or 4 years ago, but it's called Take Your Pills, and it's on Netflix.
It's good, I've watched it.
And it talks about Adderall and ADHD medication use as being like they're theorizing it's the next problematic substance use. And it makes sense, and they kind of go over like us as an American society and culture, we value productivity, we're very fast paced, we're competitive. And so in order to maintain that or rise above people that are competing with you for like a job or school, then you have to perform, right? And what helps focus and kind of keep you awake longer to get all that work done is stimulants. And so they're talking about how, and right now there's a shortage, and I'm not quite sure why there's a shortage, but there's a shortage because I have clients who have ADHD that can't get their Vyvanse prescription in because there's a shortage of it. But they kind of predicted that. They're kind of like, they can't keep up with the demand. And doctors are just kind of saying, oh, yeah, you can have it. I think they're getting better. I will say that. But yeah, here you go. Here's ADHD meds.
Without maybe meeting criteria.
Yes, yeah. And one of the things that's key for ADHD, and I'm even very hesitant, unless it's like a per history thing where I see it in their IEP, I see it in collateral documentation, I'm very hesitant to even diagnose it myself. First of all, I think it's hard on just like an evaluation, a first time meeting to kind of see all of that. But one of the key things that in diagnosing it is you have to see it in more than one setting. So it can't just be at school that they're having problems with focus. It has to be another setting. So usually that means home, but it's just interesting. I think it was very overdiagnosed in the 90s, but there is a lot of people that have it, and it's a true diagnosis. And some adults haven't been diagnosed, and they should be. And I did a whole CEU on it when I was on my maternity leave. I think I watched way too many hours of it. But it was very intriguing because it was talking about how our statistical manual in diagnosing is really catered toward kids and not adults or even adolescents. And so what are the ADHD symptoms in people who have been missed? And it also talked about the mortality rate of those who have ADHD is much higher than someone that doesn't. And if you think about it, it makes sense. They're more impulsive. They said they're more likely to have head injuries, which again, they just said like people with ADHD, they get distracted, they walk out in front of things, they slip and fall because they're not thinking about coordination. So very intriguing. I learned a lot. But yes, sleep deprivation, to round it back, definitely has an impact on substance use. Social media influence. Oh gosh, I need to keep going. So this is huge for adolescents. So Snapchat, I'm sure you guys are aware, but this is where I am hearing my adolescents that's where they're getting their substances. They will show me snaps of their drug dealer, who is often a peer the same age as them, okay? So we're not talking about drug dealers that are like in their 30s or 40s anymore. They're peers, they're the same age. And they are literally sending snaps out to all their friends, and they are showing their display. Hey, I got this in. This is what I got. Hit me up if you want it. And yeah, so that's usually like a primary mode of like how they communicate, how they're getting their substance, how they're meeting up. And like I said, drug dealers are not like what I would perceive, I guess, like when I was even in high school, like I don't know where you get drugs, but I'm guessing this older guy who has them. No, it is kids their own age. And what's appealing to that though, and that's another thing that I have to kind of like dissect with my clients in therapy, is why is drug dealing appealing to adolescents? Well, if you think about it, it's quick money, and it's a lot of money. And they will say to me, Whitney, I'm gonna get minimum wage working at a fast food place I don't wanna work at, that's crappy, that has crappy hours, and I'm gonna have to work my butt off to get the same amount that I can get in a week. And you're like, it makes sense. Also, it gives them notoriety. So it kind of gives them this self-esteem boost, right? People need me for something. And for a lot of these youth, they haven't been looked like that before, at like that before. They haven't been needed in that way. They haven't had people coming to them. And it's kind of this popularity that they're kind of seeking in a way. I had a youth that was supporting his family. And so then the family didn't want him to stop because he was the one providing. And so then when he did stop, it was really sad. I mean, it was like, then I was trying to find resources to like keep his family afloat. But I kept wondering why, like I kept trying, it didn't click with me right away, and he didn't admit it right away. And so I was trying to figure out like, why is the family being kind of weird about this? Like, and not engaged, and I was just like, I couldn't figure it out, and all of a sudden it clicked, and all of a sudden it made sense to me. And so yeah, but I also had a youth who was in when we did IOP, and I was doing IOP, intensive outpatient. He was using, but not as much as you thought. But what he was doing was he was dealing around Lincoln at night. He would leave his home, go deal around all night, and then make a bunch of money. And then he was falling asleep in classes. So they're like, "Why are you falling asleep?" And it was, sleep deprivation, because he was out all night dealing. And he's like, "Yeah, I've dealt with people that probably shouldn't have taken from me." Like basically like adults that he knew that he delivered to. I was like, oh my gosh. TikTok and Instagram. So there's a lot of videos where it depicts these other youth vaping and smoking, right? So the more you're exposed to that, the more you see it as a youth, the more you're susceptible, right? It's like ad influence, but your peers are doing it, so it's normalized, right? Everyone's doing this. It glamorizes it. The music that they're listening to glamorizes it as well, and it can lead to a shift in beliefs. Substance use, like using this much is normal. It's what everyone else is doing. It's cool to do that. There's no problems. Look at them; they have it all. Like, it just leads to these mislabeled beliefs. The problem with that, though, in social media, too, is we have these algorithms, right? And so the more you look at it, or the more you peer at something, that kicks off your algorithm and your social media to show you more of that, right? So if you're looking up weed products on your Google search engine, or you're looking up stuff, then that automatically leads it to show you all these other things. And so you're inundated with it. And the other thing I'll say about Snapchat, too, is that the youth that I'm working with are just adding random people. I'm like, I'll ask, like, well, how did you meet this person? Because, like, I realize, like, they're at a different school or different town, and I'm like, well, how did you, like, connect with this person? I realize Nebraska's a small world, but they're like, oh, they just added me on Snapchat. And I'm like, you didn't know nope, just added them. Started talking to them, they're cool. So there's really no, like, protective factors of, like, oh, maybe I shouldn't add this person, I don't know them. It's just like, oh, yep, just so casual. And that can lead to predatory behavior. And it's happening, you guys. I've had my own clients selling or providing sexual favors for marijuana, for drugs, or just for them to provide these, like, lavish purses and shoes. And so it's happening. Research shows that exposure to substance use imagery is associated with subsequent onset and use. So it's definitely influencing our youth. And like I said, it could lead to bigger issues, and I'm seeing it. The other thing, too, that marijuana use and drug use is leading to, and I think this is a correlation, may not be causation, but it's correlated to it somehow, is the violence. The violence in schools. You are getting people that are being jumped at school. It's like, what? Or jumped in the community. And a lot of the times they'll be like, well, they knew I had money, or they knew I was a dealer and that I had money on them or something on me. And so they jumped me. And it's usually peers their same age. It's not like adults or anything. So that's violence. And I've added a question now to my evaluation with youth. And I've said, have you been exposed to guns, gun violence? Have you witnessed any shootings? And you guys, it's scary. In Lincoln, it's scary. A majority of my youth have been like, yeah, I've seen a gun, I've watched someone been shot, I've seen a random shooting take place, or I've been jumped and they've held me at gunpoint to steal my drugs. So it's happening. And that's the scariest thing. And I've actually added it to my eval because I'm like, they won't necessarily bring it out and talk about it, but it's there. So warning signs of substance use. This is for those that you're like, is this happening? And I've had parents that have said, like, Winnie, I don't even know, I don't use that substance, so how would I know when they're under the influence of it? Which is a total valid question. You'll see changes in their mood. You'll see a change maybe in their friend group, or a reluctance to have them meet their new friends. So they kind of are like evasive about who they're hanging out with. Less interest in activities they normally enjoy. You'll see some academic problems. Secretive behaviors, what I mean by that is, like, they may not talk to you about things anymore, but they might be hiding in their room. They might be more secretive about their phone with you and very defensive if you try to even touch it or look at it. You might see, with clients that have had substance use problems, they may start to steal stuff from the home to sell to support their habits. So that could be money missing from home, but it also could be just weird random things. I've had people sell shoes, just things in the home, necklaces, grandma's ring, not great stuff. If they're going outside more frequently, it might be to kind of try to hide the smell, but they'll smoke in the house, try to help hide the smell too. One thing that it's a dead giveaway for me when I have a client come in for an eval is incense. They smell like incense. I'm like, there's a 90% chance that you're smoking weed. Trying to use it to hide it. If you see Visine drops out, they might be putting them in their eyes to hide like the redness effect that marijuana can give. Defensive about if you even go in their room for anything, they might be defensive because they might be hiding their stash in there. If you see, there are certain detoxes that youth can take to try to detox themselves so that they pass a urine test. One of them is fruit pectin. So if you see those wrappers around, yeah, interesting. I don't know how it affects it, but yeah, so they're trying to take. But you can buy fruit pectin. Come in a little package, yeah. But you can buy that at head shops. You can buy these little detox things. I think even on Amazon you can buy them, and they're supposed to work. In my experience, they really don't. They might work with like home tests that parents have, but with probation is like, I always tell them like, you're playing with fire. If it works once, like it's not going to work ongoing. I can tell you that, and it usually doesn't. They go to court, they test positive. They're like, Substance use prevention strategies for parents. So if you have a chance, I really like this video. Otto Schultz, he's great. He used to work for the Independence Center. But he did a really good thing about flashing your brights. And what that meant in an analogy is if you're driving past someone, they don't have their lights on, what do? You flash your brights to let them know, hey, something's going on. It's to alarm you. He says when you flash your brights, I like this kind of approach is that when you're trying to approach your child about substance use, you want to come at them with facts and versus like accusations. Even if you don't know all of the things, you want to present to them as, what am I seeing? What behaviors am I seeing that changed? You're not talking as much with us. You're isolating in your room. You've stopped doing this. You stopped drawing and you love drawing. Like, what's going on? More of a, this is what I'm seeing. The other thing that's extremely helpful for parents when they're approaching their youth about substance use or just concerning behavior in general is to start off by saying how you're feeling. So if you stick it to you, they're less likely to be defensive. And so a lot of parents, even if they're angry and you have a child who maybe got in trouble with the law or came home high or drunk and you're angry, and that's a justifiable emotion. But a lot of times underneath that anger, a parent is just scared. You're worried, you're scared. And so I always tell parents, if you say, I'm worried about this, I'm scared, I'm anxious, this runs in the family, that is, your child is more likely to listen to you than if you say, come at them with, pointing fingers and accusatory remarks. They're going to be more likely to listen to you because as much as they try, they can't take your emotion away. That's what I tell people. That's your emotion. You're owning it. You're saying, I'm worried. I'm scared. I'm frustrated. And that is going to be a much better response than saying, you're making me mad, right? Then you're going to be met with defense. Frequent and open communication, and this could be about anything. It doesn't have to be about the substance use in general. It's just checking in with them, asking questions that aren't yes or no. So eliciting a little bit more response from them. Just not how was your day, asking specific questions about their day. Leading by example, I kind of mentioned this earlier. Consistent rules with the accountability factor is key. So if you're not consistent, they're going to pick up on that and they're going to know, sometimes mom checks in, sometimes she doesn't. And then accountability just means like you hold them accountable. There are consequences to certain behavior. If you come home late, this is the consequence. If you don't tell me who you're with or what time you're going to be home, this is the consequence. And sometimes it's really hard for parents to do that, especially if they were not parented like that. And then I tell people a lot, seek to understand the underlying issue to the behavior. Don't look at the behavior. What could be causing the behavior? What's underlying that? Because, like I said, a lot of adolescents will use substances to cope with something. What are you using to cope? A lot of times they'll cover up grief. It doesn't have to be necessarily related to death. It could be just like changes, grief of loss of some sort. Maybe parents have a divorce, like that's a loss, right? So let's check in with that. What's underlying the other stuff? Could it be mental health that we're not addressing? I will say on the ADHD train really quick, I will hear the teens, they'll use marijuana to slow their brain down if they have ADHD and it's unmedicated, which makes sense to me. They say they can focus more in school when they're high. So these are just, I know these are very like simplistic, but they work. And the other thing is watch that video. I know I'm running out of time. I would talk more. Interventions, when the use becomes problematic, the first step is you need to get that child, adolescent in for a substance use evaluation. They need to do an adolescent one because there's a difference. Adolescent versus adults, different questions. And then once I have the evaluation, that evaluator will determine what's appropriate based off of the criteria they meet and how it's affecting different domains of their life. So there's psychoeducation, which just means they just need education about this substance. Outpatient, and it gets more intense as we go. IOP, partial care, and then residential. And there are, all of those are actually available in our community. IOP's back, so that's good. Yeah, that used to be a complete deficit in our. If you guys have any questions, I know I ran a little bit over time, but you can email me.